There was a BBC documentary that was up very briefly over the last week about Gaza's children, about the tens of thousands of children who have either been killed or have survived the Holocaust. Tell us about that and what you've uncovered.
Yes, that's right, Nora. So last week the BBC removed its film called Gaza: How to Survive a War Zone from its streaming service iPlayer, and it was broadcast on BBC Two, one of the broadcast channels in the UK, but it was removed from the streaming service. Now, this takedown came after an intense campaign by anti-Palestinian activists in Britain, who have close ties to the Israeli state. Now, as justification for their deletion of the film, the BBC claimed that it had been made aware only after broadcast that its narrator, who you can see on screen here, a 13-year-old Palestinian boy, Abdullah Yazuri, that he was the son of a former agricultural minister of the Palestinian government in Gaza. Now, I watched the film earlier today. It's about just under an hour long, and it is a powerful piece of work. And it's told from the point of view of several children, mostly from the point of view of children in Gaza during the post October 7th genocide in the Gaza Strip that we've been covering all this time. And it concludes around about the time of last month's ceasefire. Let's watch a short clip. I mean, there were so many segments I could have chosen, but we've just got a short clip to give you a sense of what that is like.
Order. You have to leave fast, or it can be deadly.
ايش بصير؟ زي ما انت شايف يا اخي. ايش بصير؟ فجأة في دقايق يلا امشوا في دقايق حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل بالعرب. ايش اللي بصير؟ ايش اللي بصير؟ خشوا علينا اليهود. خشوا علينا.
Thank you, Tamara. So, for listeners, I mean, you can still, just with the audio, get a sense of that. But essentially, what the clip showed was men, women, and children fleeing and crying as Israeli gunfire is heard in the background. And the narrator explained that, you know, what we've seen during the genocide, which was Palestinians repeatedly displaced from their homes, from their tents, displaced over and over again, and told that a certain area is a closed military zone or that it's a danger zone and that they must evacuate. And this is very graphically shown in that clip and throughout the film. It's a powerful and disturbing scene. Now, in an open letter to the BBC, 700 TV, film, and media workers, you know, some stars of stage and screen, as it were, as well as producers and so forth. They wrote an open letter, and they called the deletion an act of, quote, politically motivated censorship. The signatories included sports broadcaster and former footballer Gary Lineker and Harry Potter star Miriam Margolyes, as well as many others. In a clarification posted on its website, the BBC stated that there had been, quote, continuing questions raised about the programme, and in the light of these, we are conducting further due diligence with the production company. The programme will not be available on iPlayer while this is taking place, end of quote. The BBC's crackdown came after a blog post by David Collier, who is a notorious anti-Palestinian blogger with ties to Israel's former Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Collier's nonsensical claim that the documentary's narrator is part of what he called, quote, Hamas royalty was laundered by the London Times, as you can see here in this article. Despite Collier's obsessive focus on the boys' families' involvement in the civilian government of Gaza, Collier's blog post actually doesn't dispute any facts in the film. What the film does show in stark detail is Israel's systematic campaign of violence against the civilian population in Gaza. Collier's claim that the film is the product of, quote, a well-oiled Hamas propaganda machine is a total lie. I mean, if you watch the entire film, Abdullah, the child narrator, repeatedly reads out official Israeli army justifications. Every time there's an act of Israeli violence shown on screen, he reads out the spokesperson's official responses as per the usual BBC approach of quote-unquote balance. And then there is another Palestinian boy, the 11-year-old Zachariah, Zachariah rather, a young volunteer at the Al-Aqsa hospital, who really is, in my view, is really the main protagonist of the film. He spends most time on screen. It's quite, you've really taken on a journey with him and shown how he's kind of had to grow up before his time. It's very sad and tragic. But there is, towards the end of the film, when Zachariah is asked by the filmmaker if he likes Hamas, the boy says, I don't like them, and even states that they started the war. So in the BBC's selection of its interview subjects for the film, they tried their usual approach, which is a highly flawed approach in my view, of trying to impose a balance on a unbalanced reality. And this still wasn't enough for Israel and its lobby in the UK, who immediately set about crying anti-Semitism and demanding that the BBC withdraw the film. The so-called campaign against anti-Semitism, which also has close ties to Israel, held an anti-Palestinian rally outside the BBC against the film, in exactly the same spot, incidentally, where the Palestine solidarity protesters have recently been banned by the Labour government from protesting. So people who want to criticise the BBC's coverage for being biased towards Israel, for not giving enough critical coverage of Israel, were actively banned from protesting outside the BBC, whereas these pro-genocide, anti-Palestinian protesters were allowed to, from the campaign against anti-Semitism, there it is, were allowed to protest outside. And you can see they've got these kind of images of a Palestinian fighter in a mask with the BBC on their headband. So it's worth stating that David Collier, the blogger who is behind this laundering of Israeli propaganda into the Times article that we showed earlier, one of the main forces of this campaign against the BBC for this film, is known for his extreme anti-Palestinian racism, and he's defamed Palestinian refugees as a weapon, in his words, and he's also described the Palestinian desire for freedom, the Palestinian cause, as, quote, a disease. So just openly racist terms. I mean, you can see him here in this article, speaking in a panel alongside Melanie Phillips, who's quite an openly anti-Muslim columnist in the UK. You can read years of our reporting about David Collier over on our website, electronicintifada.net. If you search for his name there, we've done quite a lot of detailed reporting on that. Now, finally, it's worth saying as well that if you want to watch the censored film, I guess we're going to have to wait and see what happens with it, if it gets reinstated on the streaming platform or not. I suppose it depends on the amount of pressure that can be brought to bear on the BBC. But for now, you'll have to use an unlicensed copy, which some have been made online, some have been deleted. But this one here was posted to X by 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐿. Apologies for mispronouncing this Turkish name. But this user account has posted a full copy of the film, which you can watch it there. So I think we probably want to discuss it a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks for that. And some of the, you know, manufactured controversy around it too has been also criticism, and that's to put it mildly, of Palestinians in the film who describe Israelis as Yahud, which is kind of the regular vernacular describing Israelis. It's also, of course, translated to Jews, and people have been very upset that that Palestinians are correctly identifying their occupier and their the people who are bombing them as such. What can we say about this very manufactured controversy?
I think there's two issues. Like, you know, we work with professional translators at the Electronic Intifada. You know, especially when several of several of our colleagues, of course, speak and write Arabic, and some of them, like Ali and Tamara, and are native speakers. And we also, you know, when we work on translations from the Hebrew media, we work with the several professional translators, and one of the constant debates that we have when we're having things translated to us, and is the issue of literalism in translation versus translating the sense
Yeah.
of what makes most sense in the context for the audience. And these are not always easy questions. And, you know, yes, it's true, of course, the word Yahud in Arabic is the word for Jews. But in this context, it's very clear they're talking about Israeli soldiers who are shooting at them when they're saying
Right.
Yahud. So it's not inaccurate to describe them as Israelis in the subtitle, in my view. Nonetheless, there's a wider point really that Ali made very well on X about the nature of Israel and how they describe themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, context is important. It's very common for Palestinians in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, perhaps Palestinians in Israel, to refer to Israeli Jews as just Jews. El Yahud Iju. You know, the Jews came to the village. El Yahud Dammaru. The Jews destroyed a house or whatever it is. In that context, why do they do that? I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One is because it is Israel who identifies itself to the Palestinians as the Jews.
That's
The
right.
Israelis say, and it's now part of their constitutional law, it always has been, that Israel is the state of the Jews, and the Jews are the only people who have sovereignty between the river and the sea. And they use Jewish symbolism, the Star of David, the menorah, for their state. They put the Jewish symbols on their weapons, on their tanks, on their warplanes, on their uniforms. And the system of rule that Israel has imposed is one of what B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, accurately describes as Jewish supremacy. The reason Jewish settlers are allowed to steal Palestinian land and cut down olive trees and build settlements in their place is solely because they're Jews, solely because they're Jews. And the reason that Palestinians have no rights whatsoever, no matter how many generations back they can trace their families in Palestine, whether it's the right of refugees to return or the right of Palestinians simply to exist on their land, is solely because they're not Jews. Solely because they're not Jews. Palestinians expelled in 1948 are not allowed back by Israel solely and exclusively for not being Jews. So the only relevant identifier is that the Israeli soldiers are coming as representatives of this self-identified Jewish state. So there's nothing extraordinary about this. We wouldn't consider it strange if Jewish people during World War II referred to the Nazis as the Germans. It doesn't mean every German was a Nazi or supported the Nazis, but in the context of the war, it made sense because that's how the state identified itself. And it also predates the existence of Israel, because when the Zionist settlers came to Palestine starting in the late 1800s, they came not as Israelis. There was no such thing as Israel. They came as Jews, and they said, we're coming here because we're Jews. Of course, I don't make the mistake, and this is very important to underline, I don't make the mistake of equating Jews and Judaism on the one hand with Zionism and Israel on the other. That's an equation Israel wants us to make, and it's one that Palestinians generally don't make in the broader context. They don't equate the Israeli soldiers who are coming to murder them and expel them from their homes with Jews generally all over the world. So we're talking about something that is in the specific context of Palestinians in Palestine, referring to their oppressors in the language that the oppressors describe themselves, that Benjamin Netanyahu uses, that Itamar Ben-Gvir uses. These are their descriptors. They say we're coming as Jews. When Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, flew to Israel after October 7th to support the genocide and to give Israel flashing green lights to mass murder Palestinians, he said, I come here as a Jew. I come here as a Jew. That's what Antony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State, said. So he wanted to make clear that his support for the genocide which was about to unfold was not just as an American official, but as a Jew. So it's important to point out that it is Zionists and Israel and their supporters who are falsely equating Jews and Jewish people with these horrific crimes that Israel is perpetrating. And I'll also say that Hamas, as a part of the Palestinian resistance, has made clear repeatedly from its top leadership down, and this is part of their sort of renewed official charter that was published in 2017, they say that we fight the Israelis not because they're Jews, but because they're our oppressors. And in this exactly the same way that the Algerians fought the French, not because they didn't like camembert and brie and I don't know, what is it, baguettes and garlic and berets. It wasn't because they're anti-French or because they don't like complicated subjunctive tenses of the French language. It's because the French were their oppressors. The French had come to steal their country from them and subjugate them. That's why Algerians fought the French. When Kenyans rose up against the British, it wasn't because they didn't like tea and crumpets and gin and tonic in the afternoon on a plantation. Well, they probably didn't like that because those British plantations were land stolen from Kenyans. It was because the British came there to steal their country, to steal their labor, to effectively enslave them. And so when Palestinians fight Israel, the self-described Jewish state, it's because they're colonizers. And I just think we have to, so this fake outrage that they created, that the word Yehud was correctly translated in the context as Israeli, is just another attempt to blame victims and demonize them, when in fact, and this gets no comment from the British mainstream media or from the BBC or from all these people fakely outraged over this, that the term Muslim is used in an almost purely derogatory way, the way we saw recently Elon Musk and other right-wing international figures inciting against Muslims in the UK, the way Hamas is equated with ISIS, Western-backed ISIS, in order to demonize them and to equate them with savagery. All of this Islamophobia, all of this hatred of Muslims is so normalized. I mean, 1,000 times a day on Twitter, I'm told, you Muslims support this, you Muslims support that, you Muslims, your prophet is this, your prophet is, I'm not going to repeat the filthy, disgusting abuse they use, that you never see or with perhaps very, very, very rarely, that you never see from Palestinians. Palestinians don't denigrate Judaism as a religion. These are very rare things if they happen from misguided people. But in terms of the vast mass of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership, it never happens. To the extent that we've seen Israeli captives who are released from Gaza saying how when they were trying to survive the bombing in Gaza, the Israeli bombing, the guards tried to get them items that they could use to celebrate the Jewish holidays in captivity in Gaza. That's the extent they went to. We heard there was one thing in the Times of Israel the other day where a former Israeli captive, this was presented as saying, oh, look how cruel Hamas is, that when it was Hanukkah, which is the annual Jewish holiday that usually falls around the end of December and is celebrated by lighting candles every night, the Israeli captive said, we need candles to celebrate Hanukkah, and the guards were only able to find, these glue sticks that look like candles that were not candles. And the Israeli captive said, those aren't candles. And then the Palestinian guards went and found them like an electric candle so they could celebrate Hanukkah in captivity. And this was presented in the Times of Israel as an example of the cruelty of the Hamas guards who are making it so hard for these Jewish captives to celebrate their religion, when in fact they were trying to help them. And there were other examples of that. So I just want to say,
how many mosques have been
hundreds of mosques destroyed,
in
including
Gaza.
the Omari Mosque in Gaza, the most ancient, one of the most ancient mosques in the world, not just in Palestine, that goes back, I visited in 2013. When I visited it, it had just been restored to its glory as this beautiful ancient building, and it lies in ruins, and we don't see any outrage of that, and deliberately dynamiting mosques and filming it. That's what Israeli soldiers were doing it, and dedicating the destruction of mosques and the desecration of Qur'ans as to their friends, just as a joke. We saw them entering mosques and desecrating them, and then attaching those limpet mines to them that they used to demolish them. All of this genocidal religious hatred of Muslims and Palestinian Christians, of course, it has to be said. When we go back to the talk of the way bodies were treated, what about the way Israeli soldiers attacked the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, almost bringing her casket down in what have been absolutely even more horrific than it was? What about the way Israel has spared no one in Gaza, including the Christian community, from this genocide? And people have the chutzpah to complain that Palestinians use a word to identify their oppressors that is exactly the same word the oppressors use to identify themselves.
It's a point that our friend
It's exhausting.
Joseph Massad often makes, that this pretext and this sort of pretense that you often get from Zionists in the West, from pro-Israel propagandists, and from the state of Israel itself, that Palestinians are only fighting against the Israelis because they're Jews, presupposes that had they been any other religious or ethnic identity, they would have said, welcome, come in, take our land. It would have been completely fine if they were Buddhists or Christians or Hindus or whatever else other ethnicity or religion.
Jews
it's a complete
always
nonsense.
lived among Palestinians, and as others did, and that to prove, just Asa, to underline your point, there were always Jews in Palestine prior to the European Zionist invasion. There were always Jews in Palestine, Palestinian Jews who lived there, and Palestine was always a country whose people welcomed others. That's why you have a strong Armenian community in Palestine. That's why there's an Afro-Palestinian community in Jerusalem. That's why there are people from the Caucasus and Chechnya and Bosnia whose roots go back generations in Palestine, because the Palestinian people, the indigenous people of Palestine, were always welcoming and open to people, including Jews who came from Europe prior to the Zionist movement, but who came on religious pilgrimages or to study. They didn't come as colonizers. They didn't come to take over the country and establish a so-called Jewish state. So just this lie is another projection by Zionists in Israel to demonize Palestinians and justify their murder. But what it is projection. It's a reflection of the racial and ethnic and religious hatred that the Zionist colonizers bear towards the indigenous people of Palestine, that as we speak right now, they are still trying to destroy, if not through bombing, because of the so-called ceasefire, through continued attempts to starve them to death and to freeze them to death, which is what's happening now because of the continued refusal of Israel to allow in adequate humanitarian supplies, as is required by the deal that Israel signed.
Right. I mean, I'm just reminded of the children's art that had been, and this is something that I covered for the Electronic Intifada back in, I don't know what, 2010, 2011, where right after Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, children in Gaza who were working with organizations like the Middle East Children's Alliance and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 in Gaza made artwork to process their trauma of living through 3 weeks, which was a long time at the time. I mean, compared with 16 months, 3 weeks of relentless assaults that killed hundreds and hundreds of children, destroyed homes and infrastructure. And these children were drawing art as a form of therapy, as a form of trying to untangle all of these emotions of fear and of despair and grief. And they were drawing, some of these drawings had, drawings of children being bombed, and the warplanes had, the flag, the Israeli flag on it, which has the Star of David. And when this artwork was due to be shown around the world, but starting here in California, these Zionist organizations pitched a fit and said that these drawings were anti-Semitic, that these children were bigoted against Jews, and the reason why was because they were drawing the Star of David on the warplanes. That were an accurate reflection of the Star of David that Israel puts on its own warplanes and on its patches on their soldiers and on the flags that they plant on Palestinians' land. And so this real, and just in the last, couple of months, we saw bulldozers in Gaza bulldozing an enormous Star of David into the land. We've seen Palestinian detainees with Stars of David carved into their skin. Just yesterday, I was perusing the news. I saw a young boy in the occupied West Bank who crossed a checkpoint, and one of the soldiers, drew a Star of David on his hand with a pen. So if these are the symbols that Israel has said are a reflection of its people, the only people who they think should be there, the Jewish people, the state of the Jews and Jews only, an ethno-nationalist state. And so when Palestinians are accurately describing the symbols that their occupier are carving into their skin or into their land, or putting on flags that are planted on their houses, that's somehow seen as bigoted or anti-Semitic. It is just unbelievable.
We can show one of those examples, Tamara. I just dropped in the in the chat. I don't know if it's possible to put up this story from Al Jazeera, which shows satellite images of, or aerial images anyway, of Israeli tanks carving the Star of David, this symbol of Judaism, into the land in Gaza.
Yeah, look at that.
And what's the military purpose of that? There isn't one. This is just a show of racial, ethnic, and religious supremacy.
And really just the desecration of symbols like that. I mean, I don't do the as a Jew thing, but as a Jewish person, seeing these symbols as forms of desecration, of supremacy, of oppression and occupation, of apartheid, of genocide, of Holocaust, it disgusts me. And this is Israeli policy. This is Zionism. And it is unforgivable that, Palestinians who didn't choose the religion of their occupier, it's not their fault that their occupier happened to be Jewish, that they're just, criticized and denigrated and disrespected in this way. It's just despicable.
And here's another story, just because you referenced it, Nora. There may be another one, but this is the one that I recall from, and this is actually from August of 2023. So just a couple of months before the start of the genocide of a Palestinian man who said that Israeli police basically branded or marked a Star of David into his face. And there were photos of that. The Israeli police claimed it wasn't deliberate. It was because basically we kicked him in the face with our boots, and that's what the shape of the shoelaces on the boots did. So the explanation was almost as bad as the accusation, you could say. But there are other examples of this kind of deliberate use, and we saw the TikTok videos, the sort of things that I suspect that the Hint Rajab project has collected in its massive database to go after Israeli soldiers who've engaged in these crimes, particularly the deliberate desecration of religious sites by Israeli soldiers.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you for that. And it's as I said, it's just exhausting to try to have to relitigate this over and over again and over again and deal with the kind of vitriol and just racist double standards in the media, where Palestinians aren't even able to criticize their occupiers. It's just it's horrifying.